we can never learn to live together in peace as long as we're killing each other's children. We are two women from two different countries and two different generations. I am from Iran.
And I'm from Kurdistan. We're here to share our stories based on our lived experiences, which relate to the course of events that has happened in our countries. These events have changed and influenced both us, but also the relationships between countries in the world today, in an effort to shed light on this question.
Is it possible that the realities of the world today are not, with regards to the Kurds, the Iranians, and the Middle Easterners for that matter, are not about the fact that there's a group of evil Islamic radicals that are there to destroy the Western world, but in fact, there are people that are here that we want to share our stories with that will not vilify anyone, but will rehumanize a region of the world and allow us to have no more moral exclusion and to have rehumanization of the people that we care and have come to live with.
And for real though, who are the Kurds? These Kurds that Kavi cannot and does not stop talking about? And what does this have to do with the Kurdish people at all? So, named everything from the indigenous people of the world's earliest civilization, also known as Mesopotamia, all the way to modern Turks. The Kurds are the Middle East's fourth largest ethnic group and the world's largest nation of about 40 million people that does not have an independent nation state. The great land of Kurdistan was divided by the British and the French army after World War I, and it was never given back to us, though it was promised. Today, we call Iraq, Armenia, Syria, Turkey, and Iran our homes.
In 1953, there was an overthrow of Mohammad Mossadegh, who is the elected prime minister of Iran. He was democratically elected, widely popular, and actually voted in 1951 by Time magazine as the Man of the Year. His only crime was that he wanted to nationalize Iranian oil. He represented democracy in Iran, and he also represented Iranian sovereignty. The CIA and officials came in, they overthrew Mossadegh, and they reinstated the Shah, the king of Iran, Mohammad Reza Pahlavi. When he became reinstated, they co-created a police state. They also established and built the Savak, the Shah's secret police. After a decade of injustices toward the people of Iran, with economic class struggles, bad policies poorly implemented, the people, after 25 years, decide to stand up to these injustices. In this time, they see that the United States' role, in conjunction with the Shah, and their collaborations with one another, held them both responsible for the mistreatment and the abuse of the Iranian people.
Something very similar happened to the Kurds a little later in time when the US intelligence officials and the CIA helped in putting Saddam Hussein, a previously dictator and very popular president of Iraq, into power in 1963. However, Iraq made a big mistake, and Saddam Hussein obviously did a big mistake by invading Kuwait in 1990. And that is when President George H.W. Bush, the then president of the United States, encouraged all Iraqis, including the Kurds, to put Saddam Hussein aside. At this time, the Kurds were still healing and recovering from the very big genocide and trauma of the Halabja genocide, which killed 180,000 people in one day by chemical attacks back in 1988. So this encouragement from the US and the pain of the Kurds that was caused by this regime led 2 million Kurds in the Kurdistan of Iraq to flee to Iran in March 1991. Because guess what? Turkey had its borders close to us, just like how they have their airports close to us now. The stories along the way are the stories that I've grown up with. Now, stories of Cinderella, nor the Sleeping Beauty. The stories of how my mother and my aunt gave 2 liters of blood right before starting their 200-mile journey to Iran. How my 12-year-old uncle's feet were bleeding, and my grandmother, a single mother of 6, was drenched as they took this journey. Many, many families couldn't even keep carrying their babies or elderlies or keep feeding them because of very desperate conditions on the journey.
The Ayatollah Khomeini was a clergyman in Iran and a staunch man that was against the Shah Sr. during the time, just before the coup of Mohammad Mossadegh. He lived in exile in Najaf, Iraq, for 14 years. Upon the request of Saddam Hussein, in 1978, he's asked to leave the country, where he flees to Paris, France, and remotely directs and leads a group of Iranian students to overthrow the US Embassy in Iran, in Tehran. They take 52 hostages. And at this time, Jimmy Carter, the president of the United States, and 444 days later, he negotiates in 1981 the release of these hostages. But unknown to anybody, these hostages are detained for no reasons that were disclosed, until 5 minutes after President Reagan is sworn into office. The Iran-Contra scandal a decade later indicates that the United States, at the time, President Reagan's senior administration, was making deals with the Iranians, and they were selling arms to them, leading to the release of the Iranian hostages. To avoid getting too much further into the slippery slope of history, I'm going to share my own history as it relates to these stories. I come from two different cultures, the East and the West, and I grew up in Iran until I was 12 years old. My father is an American, and he works for a petroleum engineering company in the Persian Gulf, living in Malta with his new family. My mother is an Iranian actress and has changed careers in the early 70s to work for the US Embassy as a lieutenant secretary during this time.
My mother is a Kurdish patriotic mother, and my father is a Kurdish Sunni Muslim father. So, my grandfather, was a very dedicated Kurdish fighter during the time of the regime, or Peshmerga, which literally translates to those who face death. He was killed by his own bodyguard, who was bribed by Saddam Hussein at the age of 32. So as you can imagine, all the way from my grandmother down to the youngest cousin of the family, we all share a responsibility of honoring this sacrifice, because it was made for the freedom of the Kurds and Kurdistan. However, on the other side, Islam was the stronger part of my father's identity. And this religious identity of my father, along with many other peoples, was strongly reinforced when the Iranian Muslim scholars come into Kurdistan after the flight of the Kurds into Iran in the 1990s.
At this time, I live with my mother in Iran, and upon my father's request, I attend Tehran American School, TAS. In the high school, they had 2 football teams and 2 sets of cheerleaders. That's no small feat for an overseas school. And one of the blessings of biculturalism. In my grade, what was defined as really cool was if you were in brownies and what you carried in your lunchbox. And that meant Pop-Tarts, Twinkies, and snowballs. If you didn't have those, you were not one of the cool kids. Well, unfortunately, I was not one of those cool kids, because I was never going to be in Twinkies, and I was never going to be in brownies, and I was never going to have Twinkies in my lunchbox.
So the blessing for me was that I grew up, by the way, that's what was in her lunchbox. The blessing of me growing up in such a family with such different values, priorities, and dynamics was that I had a wide perspective. I could have a taste of it all. I could have more than just being Kurdish or just being Muslim. Though I never really struggled with lunchboxes, but I did struggle with the liminality of 2 different educations from both of my parents. The fact that I had to really figure out who I really was challenging, because I was from these stories of Kurd struggles, but I was also from Ramadan fasting. So for the longest time, I was neither, but I was also both.
In 1978, I'm in 6th grade, and I'm about 11 years old. The revolutionary uprising had reached its peak. By September, my school had permanently shut down, and the tanks with machine gun-toting soldiers decorated them all over the streets like wedding cakes. they were having face-offs with unarmed civilians. There was bonfires everywhere, burning anything that symbolized the Shah and his allies. The smoke from the fires was left like a haze of gloom throughout the sky and in the air. It penetrated your nose just like glue. And it burned your eyes and your ears and your throat the moment you went outside. There was only a few things that operated on schedule at that time. One, it was the 8 o'clock curfew where the lights went out in the whole city. And two, the shootings. The shootings would begin as soon as the lights would go out. People were advised to lie on the floor so they could avoid being hit by stray bullets at night. And the only other thing that happened on time was my Uncle Saeed would always arrive exactly at the moment before curfew with a book that was printed daily and published that afternoon by Sabak, the Shah's secret police. We would all gather around in my family downstairs in my grandmother's dining room table, and we would listen to my uncle read from these books in candlelight of the torture treatment that would happen to these prisoners of war. And they were only prisoners of war in the sense that they were writing as philosophers or creating songs as musicians and artists and poets and speaking against the Shah, or potentially interpreted as speaking against the Shah. Carter convinces the Shah to release these prisoners. And my Aunt Shahrazad convinces my young mother that we have to go see this historic event. Well, to my grandmother, who is a police lieutenant's dismay, we leave the house that next day, and we take off in the streets. We're holding hands, arm in arm, making sure that we form a human chain so we don't get separated from one another. And my palms are sweaty, my heart is racing, and I feel a lot of anxiety. We finally arrive, and somehow my mom has gotten us to the front row of the release of these political prisoners. The sea of people around us was 360-degree point. But just in this area between the entrance of the prison and where we were standing, there was a space for the prisoners to walk through. And the silence in the air was filled with fear and anticipation. As the doors opened and the first man emerged, my eyes locked onto him and my heart broke because he was a broken man. He was missing body parts and he was missing a spirit. And each one of them emerged exactly the same way, with photographs of themselves before entering prison. They were brilliant, handsome, vibrant young men, no longer the same. And at that moment, something hit me. I had the realization that this, what I was hearing by candlelight, read to me by my Uncle Saeed, was reality. It was not something that I had made up in my imagination. And I realized that that reality can happen to anyone, anywhere in the world, no matter where you're from, as long as the people that are in power see that to be the truth, that you are a criminal for what you stand for.
Not that the new government of Iran was really good or better than the Shah, at least not for the Kurds. Because 2 months after the revolution ended, there was an enormous rebellious Kurdish uprising against the government in Iran, which resulted in the death of 10,000 Kurds. Yet another genocide of the Kurds in their what's so-called home country. As Fatimi's experience dates back a little to the past, mine is a bit more recent. It's funny, it seems like for some of us, no matter how forward we go, some things just don't change. I've spent the past few years waking up and slipping to news of ISIS, the Islamic State in Iraq and Sham. I've been living in the fear of losing friends, family members, and fellow Kurds, even when I'm living away from home, even now. Waking up to news of Kurdish fighters, or Peshmerga, and their death in the process of protecting countries that does not even acknowledge them or give them their basic rights as humans is heart-wrenching. So all these struggles, all these stories of the Kurds, I'm from all of them. And I realized that it's hard. I realized that it's hard to be a Kurd. So talking about the Kurds for me is a never-ending thing, and it's my responsibility to do so. I hold the responsibility to do so.
I've lost family and friends to the Iran-Iraq War, some to the war itself, and some as an aftermath from the emotional trauma that they experienced thereafter. Eckhart Tolle once said, "There are times in a person's life where everything that has created their story has collapsed around them, and it is stripped away. And it is in that moment that we have an opportunity to flower our consciousness and for it to be present itself."
As a result of the flowering of our consciousness, we've come to the realization of our personal truths to become the voice of our people instead of falling victim to our circumstances. We've realized that we hold the responsibility to advocate for the people and the truths that so many of us are deprived of. Due to globalization and the modern technology that we use today, the new generation reacts differently to these things. In a sense that we see that we're from countries that are ranked amongst the most corrupt, dangerous, and poorest countries. And as if that is not enough, we as Kurds have to deal with ethnic, religious, and language rejections. Every time I validate my identity as a Kurdish person, I have to deal with comments from fellow Iraqi Arabs that we're one and Kurds and Arabs are not different. And every time I declare that we're not, because obviously that is what my grandfather died for. However, that never gives you the right, neither the chance, to genocide me. But we don't fall for the circumstances, we stand up and we keep speaking up for our people.
Awakened in my consciousness and realizing that I have an agenda or a job to do, which is to represent my people well, but also to create change in the world, this type of change that Mahatma Gandhi talks about. So in this dream, I have is to actualize the Eudaimonia Human Flourishing Project, which its intention is to unify people of a region, for refugees to come together and have a sense of community with the communities in which they reside in, through community building projects with care, compassion, and understanding. One of the strengths that Kevi and I bring here is that we as two women, which are often marginalized, and as people from a country that are also marginalized, we stand here before you to say, take advantages of the privileges that you are offered in your life and use them in a way that can bring change and positive change to the world so that you can actualize a different world for all of us as well.
So after all of this, I'm privileged enough to come to UWC USA and meet people, wonderful people from all over the world, some of which struggle with dual or even triple nationalities. Whereas I struggle with keeping the one and only nationality and identity that I have and want to get recognized by. Each time I introduce myself, because my identity has to be genocided so many times, it always has to take longer than 5 seconds. The sequence of events and the intergenerational connection that me and Fatima just presented to you creates a big question regarding the future as we move forward for people like us. Will history keep dressing up and keep repeating itself for people like us? Thank you.
Thank you.